A solitary rancher, hardened by years of silence and Wyoming winters, once opened his door to a woman and her child, intending only a night of shelter, never expecting they'd take permanent residence in his heart. It was December 1878. Snow had covered the land for days, blanketing everything in a deep, endless white. The wind tore across the open plain like a grieving animal, its cry raw, echoing through the empty hills. Above Eli McCall's ranch, the sky sagged heavy, pale gray like the underside of old bone, offering neither mercy nor light. His modest cabin stood in the middle of 300 acres, surrounded by nothing but frozen stillness, as though the world itself had paused. No tracks had broken the snow in over a week. Even the cattle had vanished into the drifts, their silhouettes lost. Inside, Eli crouched by a reluctant fire, coaxing the final pieces of pine into flame. Sparks snapped and vanished against the hearth's stone mouth. His shoulders ached beneath a worn wool shirt. The cold had become a part of him, no longer an intruder, but a constant companion. Outside, the wind surged again. Then came a knock, not hesitant or gentle, but urgent and raw. 3 sharp raps, followed by 2 more, faster, panicked. Eli stiffened, one hand reaching instinctively for the iron poker. His eyes narrowed. When the sound came again, he moved toward the door, grabbing the Winchester rifle with deliberate calm. Each step across the creaking floor was careful, measured. Hand on the latch. He paused, cocked the rifle with a sound that broke the room's silence like glass. The storm hit the walls once more, a reminder of the isolation. Then he opened the door. There, framed by wind and snow, stood a woman. Her wool cloak hung heavy with ice. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands, tangled with flakes. Her face was white, lips blue at the edges. In her arms was a boy, small, still, no more than 6, wrapped in a threadbare blanket that did little to fight the cold. His cheeks, though flushed, held no movement. Her eyes, wide and filled with both hope and desperation, found his. Her voice broke the tension. "Please," she said through teeth that trembled as much from fear as from frost. "Just one night. My boy is freezing." Eli's rifle remained steady, pointed toward the ground but unwavering. "I don't take in strangers," he said, voice flat, eyes cold. "Not at this hour." She didn't step back. Her eyes dropped to the child, then returned to him, her voice faltering but firm. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death." Eli's gaze scanned her, mud-streaked boots, fingers gone red and raw, a shoulder arch around the child like a broken wing trying to protect. The boy's lips were blue, fingers stiff, a breath barely visible. Something inside Eli, something buried for years, lurched. He lowered the rifle. "Get in," he muttered. She didn't hesitate. She crossed the threshold in an instant, melting snow trailing behind her. He shut the door with finality, tossed another log into the fire, and gestured. "Sit there. Get him warm." She dropped to the hearth without a word, hands moving quickly across the boy's limbs, rubbing, whispering, holding him closer to the flames. Her back trembled with the weight of unspoken fear. Eli stayed on his feet, gun still in hand, eyes locked on them. "You got a name?" he asked. Her voice barely rose above the crackle of fire. "Lydia," she whispered. "His name's Thomas." Eli gave a short nod. Crossing the room, he opened a cabinet and pulled out a worn quilt, the threads loose from years of use. Without a word, he knelt beside them, wrapping the fabric around mother and son. She flinched but didn't move away. He returned to the chair by the fire's edge, watching. A stranger and her child, pulled from the blizzard like ghosts from another life he'd long buried. Silence took hold. The wind raged beyond the walls, but inside, time felt suspended. A man who had long since closed his heart sat guard over 2 souls he didn't know. And in that moment, something within him began to shift. The cabin, once frozen with emptiness, slowly warmed. Frost still clung to the windows, stubborn and unmoved. Eli filled a tin cup with hot water, dropping in dried mountain mint he'd saved since autumn, a ritual he'd nearly forgotten. The scent rose faintly. He walked to her, offered it without a word. She looked up, startled, mistrust flickering across her face before it gave way to something softer. "Thank you," she said, the words more breath than sound. Eli nodded, turned back to tend the fire. Thomas, now wrapped thickly, had begun to breathe with a little more rhythm. His skin held a hint of returning color. Still no words from him. Eli glanced over. "Where were you headed?" he asked. Lydia held the warm cup with both hands, her fingers still shaking. "South," she replied, voice quiet. "Somewhere warmer." Eli didn't turn. "You traveling alone?" A long silence followed. She stared into the fire before answering. "No, not really." He stood, moved the rifle aside, and sat across from her, the flames between them. "You being chased?" Her hands trembled harder. The cup rattled. "I don't want trouble," she said, voice tight, fear beneath every word. "We were passing through, but someone's after us. A man. We had to keep moving." Eli's expression darkened. He said nothing. Instead, he watched how she clutched the boy closer. "Your husband?" he asked at last. Her reaction was immediate. Head jerked up, eyes sharp, then turned away. "Not anymore," she said, final. He didn't press her. He stood and went prepare a cot by the fire. "He can take the bed," he said. "It's warmer. You sleep here." She looked at him, a question in her eyes that never made it to her lips. Eli didn't wait. He stepped into the back room, returned with a pillow and extra blanket, set them down gently beside her. "Use what you need." Then he walked to the door, bolted it shut with a wooden bar, and placed the rifle within reach on the table. Her voice followed him. "Do you always sleep with a gun?" He looked over his shoulder, eyes weary. "I stopped trusting silence a long time ago." She didn't answer, just looked away. The boy stirred in his sleep, a small sound escaping his lips. Lydia pressed her palm to his forehead and leaned back, her exhaustion finally breaking through. The cup cooled in her hands. Her mouth moved silently in prayer. Eli sat near the window, the storm howling beyond. And in that strange, frozen hour, something unspoken passed between them. A thaw, faint as spring beneath ice, beginning to bloom where there had only been cold. He lit a lantern low, just enough to chase shadows to corners and keep the darkness from telling lies. Outside, the snowfall continued its slow, soundless descent, flakes drifting past a window pane like bits of ash from some invisible fire, soft and relentless. The hours unfolded with quiet insistence. The fire crackled every so often, small pops punctuating the silence. Lydia and the boy slept curled together, breaths rising and falling in near-perfect rhythm, like some delicate, unspoken lullaby. Eli sat unmoving, fixed between the glow of the hearth and the dull sheen of frost gathering around the window's edge. A few hours ago, these two souls had not existed to him. Now, their nearness stirred something deep and unfamiliar beneath the layers of solitude that time had built over his chest. Around the third hour of silence, he stood with quiet resolve, walked with deliberate care across the room, and retrieved a thicker quilt from the wooden bench. His movements were slow, respectful, as if afraid to disturb whatever fragile peace sleep had granted them. He bent and gently spread the quilt over their bodies, tucking its corners near their shoulders. Lydia shifted slightly but did not wake. Her face slack in sleep, yet the lines of worry still clung there, etched by more than one hard winter. Eli hesitated, his hand hovering midair as if to brush a strand of damp hair from her brow. But something stopped him, some boundary he would not yet cross. He turned away without finishing the gesture, returning to his post by the window, and this time his hand settled on the worn wooden stock of the Winchester. He did not close his eyes. He did not drift. The snow still fell, the fire still burned, and Eli McCall remained awake, not out of fear, not out of habit, but because a nameless woman and a silent child were asleep in his home, wrapped in his quilts, under his watch. And though he would never admit it aloud, he kept watch not from caution, but from care. Morning arrived slowly, with pale light that filtered through the thick veil of clouds still draped across the sky. The worst of the storm had moved on, but the cold lingered, heavy and stubborn. Eli had already stepped outside, the chill biting into his skin as he fed and checked the livestock. When he returned, boots crusted in ice, he stomped the snow free on the threshold and stepped back into the cabin. Inside, the fire had died to low embers. Lydia was already awake, sitting on the floor by the hearth, her face drawn, shadows beneath her eyes. She dabbed at Thomas's forehead with a damp cloth, worry clinging to her like the steam in the room. "He's burning up," she said, her voice rough with fatigue. "I'm sorry. We'll leave. This shouldn't be your burden." Eli removed his gloves and walked toward them, his eyes moving over the boy's flushed face. Sweat gathered at his brow despite the chill. "He's no burden," Eli said plainly. "You're not going anywhere until he's better." Lydia looked at him. Startled, she opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off with quiet firmness. "I do not repeat myself." His tone held no sharpness, only certainty, like a stone set into the earth. He turned to the stove, lifted a dented pot from the shelf, filled it with water from a ceramic jug, and set it over the fire. "You got anything for fever?" he asked without looking. She shook her head. "Then I'll make do." He moved with rough but measured hands, selecting dried roots from a jar, breaking them carefully. He added barley, bits of dried meat, all the while stirring with a kind of rustic precision. His back was to her, but she studied him, this man who had given her warmth, safety, and now soup. "I don't understand you," she said at last, voice low but sincere. Eli stirred the pot. "What's understand? You took us in. You let a stranger sleep beside your fire. You gave your bed to a boy you don't know. And now you cook." Eli's voice was quiet, matter of fact. "I thought about turning you away. Then I saw his face." Lydia lowered her gaze, pulling the blanket more tightly around Thomas, whose small body trembled in his fevered sleep. After a moment of silence, she spoke again. "He's not mine." Eli paused, waiting. "I didn't give birth to him," she clarified. "His mother was my friend. She helped me escape my husband, gave me coin, time, shelter, told me to run. She stayed behind to mislead him. She bought me my head start with her life." Lydia's voice trembled, but she did not cry. "He killed her. My husband. Said if he ever saw me again, he'd do worse. Thomas was left with nothing, so I took him." Eli turned then, slowly, resting his back against the counter, eyes on her face. She stared into the fire, fingers brushing the boy's matted hair. "And now he's mine," she said softly, "even if I am not his." Neither of them spoke for a time. The stew bubbled behind him, and the wind scratched at the cabin walls like some half-forgotten ghost. Finally, Eli stepped forward and knelt beside the boy. He took the cloth from Lydia's hands, dipped it in the cool basin water, wrung it gently, then pressed it to the child's forehead with remarkable care. Lydia watched his movements, surprised by the tenderness in his weather-worn hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli stood again. "He'll need to eat when he wakes." He glanced down, picked up a small scrap of cloth that had slipped to the floor, Thomas's blanket, worn thin and fraying along the edges. Wordlessly, he carried it to the table by the window, retrieved a needle and a spool of coarse black thread from a tin, and began stitching. The movements were slow, stiff, and clumsy, but steady. His hands weren't made for sewing, but still, he mended what he could. Lydia watched without speaking, her breath held somewhere between awe and ache. Her lips parted, maybe to ask why, maybe just to breathe, but no words found their way out. Across the room, the man who had barely spoken since she'd arrived, who moved with the rigid grace of a soldier and held himself tighter than a man in chains, sat hunched over a child's torn blanket. His rough fingers moved awkwardly but with a strange gentleness, threading black stitch after black stitch into the worn fabric. No one had done anything that tender for her in longer than she could remember, not even when she was still someone's wife. Something inside her shifted, not loudly. It wasn't a break, not yet, just a first fine fracture, a thin line of warmth cutting across the frost she kept around her heart. Eli tied the final knot in the thread, clipped it, and folded the small square with quiet precision. He placed it by the fire as if it were something sacred. Then, still not looking at her, he said, "I'll keep watch tonight. You get some rest." She stood slowly, her joints stiff, and crossed the room toward the bed where Thomas lay, flushed but peaceful. She sat at his side, brushed a knuckle along his cheek, and glanced once over her shoulder. Eli had already returned to the chair near the window. His rifle rested by the frame, and his eyes were cast outward, searching something unseen in the distance. But his posture had changed. His shoulders had lost a measure of tension, and in the way he sat, quiet, alert, but somehow softened, there was a stillness that no longer felt empty. Neither of them said it, but they both felt it. The silence was different now. Not cold, not hollow. Something had entered the house. It wasn't the storm. It was something that had crept in between words, between breaths, in the space made when two people stopped being strangers. The days that followed moved with the slow rhythm of melting ice, each hour dragging the land just slightly closer to spring, though the world outside remained locked in winter's hard grip. But inside the cabin, something had begun to breathe, something warmer than fire. By the second morning, Thomas's fever had broken. He was pale and weak, but smiled faintly as Lydia spooned broth into his mouth from a wooden bowl. Eli had kept the pot simmering all night, rising every few hours to check the heat and stir. The boy still said little, but his eyes followed Eli everywhere, and when Lydia moved, he clung to her shawl as if it were the only thing tethering him to the world. Lydia never mentioned leaving. The words never came, and Eli never asked. Each morning, she rose quietly before the sun, bundled in her shawl, and joined him on his morning rounds. She moved with a quiet determination, though it was clear the work was unfamiliar. She mucked the stalls in clumsy rhythm, held the fence post while he bent over a restless mare, and by the third day, she was stacking firewood with steady hands. Her sleeves rolled past her elbows, her dark hair tied back in a loose knot that caught in the wind. As she hauled the last log to shed, Eli stood nearby, watching. "You're not half bad," he muttered. Lydia raised an eyebrow, smirking. "You say that like it surprises you." He gave a grunt in reply, gruff but for him, close to laughter. Later, they stood side by side in the clearing behind the cabin, chopping fresh wood. The snow sparkled under a pale, cold sun, like shards of crystal scattered across the ground. Eli swung the axe with muscle memory precision, while Lydia gathered the split logs into a basket and carried them to the porch. After the last one was stacked, Eli reached into his coat and pulled something from the inner pocket. "Found these up in the loft," he said, holding them out. "Figured your hands might be tired of freezing." Lydia looked down. A pair of old leather gloves, worn but clearly cared for, softened by oil and time. She hesitated. "I can't take those," she said, voice low. "They're just gloves," Eli replied. Her fingers brushed his as she accepted them, and when she looked up, his gaze met hers, calm, unwavering, with softness that didn't ask anything in return. Not pity, not possession, just presence. Her throat tightened. She clutched the gloves to her chest and looked away. That evening, as dusk painted the snow in hues of violet and silver, Thomas scurried across the cabin floor, his laughter rising in short bursts as he galloped a small wooden horse Eli had carved that morning. The toy was crude but sturdy, its edges sanded smooth, painted with a bit of leftover ash and coffee grounds. Thomas tripped over the rug and fell forward, catching himself on both hands. The toy clattered beside him. "Papa!" he cried, the word tumbling out instinctively. The room went still. Lydia froze. Her breath caught halfway to her lungs. Thomas turned Eli with wide eyes, unsure, uncertain. "I meant," he stammered. Eli walked to him slowly, crouched down, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, son," he said, steady and sure. The boy blinked, then nodded once. Then he smiled. Lydia turned away, retreating onto the porch with shaking breath. The cold struck her bare arms like a warning, but she let it. She needed it. She wrapped her arms around herself, gripped the railing, and stared out at the horizon buried beneath endless snow. She should be grateful. She should be running. But something had changed. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to feel it. They were alive, safe, warm. The cabin held the smell of fire and stew, of pine smoke, and was drying on hooks. But the boy calling him Papa, and Eli, a man who had spent years walling off his soul brick by brick, welcoming them into his days, sharing meals, patching torn quilts, carving toys with weathered hands. These were not the kinds of kindnesses Lydia had allowed herself to hope for. Her chest ached with the weight of it. This was never meant to be hers. Through the frost-glazed window, she watched Eli lift Thomas gently onto his lap by the fire. The boy laughed softly, head resting against Eli's shoulder, trust blooming in the space where fear had once lived. Lydia pressed a hand to her chest, as if trying to contain something breaking open inside her. She knew what she was seeing. She'd known it for days. This was the kind of man women spent lifetimes searching for. The kind who spoke little but whose actions built shelter, safety, belonging, and she, marked by running, hunted by her past, hollowed by a life that had never been kind. She was not the kind of woman who got to keep someone like him, even though her heart, long weary and battle-worn, had already begun to whisper otherwise. Outside, the snow softened, drifting now like ash more than ice, and the days stretched into quiet repetitions, gathering firewood, tending animals, boiling broth. Yet beneath the simplicity, something stirred, something unspoken that neither dared name. Lydia felt it rising like warmth beneath cold stone, and it frightened her. She had grown too used to silence, to hiding, to being no one. But here, with him, she was someone again. She began to retreat, not from Eli, but from herself, from the feelings she could no longer deny. She no longer lingered after supper. She stopped meeting his eyes when their hands brushed during chores. She read longer stories to Thomas at night, trying to fill the space between dusk and sleep with anything but silence. And Eli, a man who had learned patience through pain, let her. He did not chase her, but his glances lingered longer, soft, uncertain. He noticed, and he waited, that night, after the cabin had gone still and Thomas's breathing had evened into dreams. Lydia stood in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The fire glowed low, casting its gold across Eli's face as he sat by the hearth, sharpening a blade in slow, deliberate motions. He looked up as she entered, his gaze steady. "You need something?" he asked, voice low, familiar now in its quiet strength. She shook her head. Then she stepped closer, her breath shallow, her hands trembling where they clutched her shawl. I couldn't sleep." Eli set the blade down without a sound. "Storm's coming tomorrow," he said. "We'll be snowed in for a while." She nodded, not really hearing. She sat down across from him, staring into the flames. Silence stretched. Then, just above a whisper, she said, "I thought one night would be enough." Eli tilted his head, watching her, enough to rest, to survive the cold, to say thank you and move on. He waited. She didn't look at him. She stared into the fire like it held the answer to something she couldn't name. "But now," her voice cracked, "now I'm afraid of tomorrow." Eli leaned forward, his voice softer now. "Because you know you can't stay?" Lydia nodded, then shook her head, both truths tangled inside her. "Because I want to." The confession left her like a wound torn open. "And I know I shouldn't. But leaving," her eyes welled. "It feels like tearing something out of my chest." Eli stood, walked to her. He knelt slowly in front of her chair, his hand resting gently on hers, calloused fingers rough but warm. "You don't owe me anything, Lydia." She looked at him, eyes shimmering. "That's the problem," she whispered. "I want to." The fire cracked behind them, and in the hush that followed, she leaned forward. Their lips met, unhurried, uncertain, but filled with something neither of them had dared hope for. Her fingers clutched the fabric of his shirt. His hands cupped her face like she might vanish if he let go. When they pulled apart, breath mingling in the still air, Eli's voice came soft, near reverent. "If you have to go, at least know this. Someone here wanted you to stay." Lydia closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to believe that being wanted could be enough, that someone could see her not as a weight to carry, but a woman worth anchoring. But even in that warmth, she knew love had never been her escape, and some roots, no matter how deep they reach, are planted too late. Morning arrived, cloaked in fog. The sky was a muted gray, the air heavy with the weight of what had not yet happened. The birds did not sing. Even the trees stood still. Eli emerged from the barn, shovel in hand, when something on the snow caught his eye, faint impressions just beneath the crusted top layer. Not hooves. Boots. Deep, Fresh. He scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but every muscle in his body coiled. Inside the cabin, Lydia was stoking the fire, humming softly to Thomas as he blinked awake, warm beneath the blankets. When Eli stepped in, the look on his face stopped her mid-motion. She rose. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the table. There, placed dead center, was a silver coin, unassuming to most, but not to Lydia. Her blood turned to ice. She reached out with shaking fingers, turned it over, a crude skull carved into one side. Her breath hitched. "No," she whispered. "He found us." Eli took the coin gently from her hand. "You know it?" She nodded, voice barely steady. "It's from one of my husband's men, not a marshal, a hunter, a tracker, paid in gold, bound by nothing. He leaves a mark when he wants you to feel him breathing down your neck." She looked up, her voice cracking. "If he left this, he's already watching." Eli turned to the window. His hand reached for the rifle, but before he could grasp it, a knock echoed to the cabin. Once, twice, slow, deliberate. Lydia flinched. Eli stepped to the door, rifle raised. When he opened it, a man stood just beyond the threshold. He wore a long coat glazed with frost. A wide brim had pulled low over his eyes. A scar curved down his cheek, like a blade had kissed him and meant it. His gloved hands were empty. "Morning," the man said, voice calm, smooth as ice across steel. "Name's Jasper Cole. I'm here for the woman." Lydia appeared beside Eli, jaw tight. Eli didn't lower the rifle. "She's not going anywhere." Jasper smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I've got papers says otherwise." He pulled a folded parchment from his coat and held it up. "Arrest warrant, filed in Cheyenne. Theft and kidnapping. Her legal husband's charges. I'm to bring her back. Alive, preferably." Eli didn't blink. "She stole nothing. The boy's mother is dead." Jasper tilted his head. "Not my concern. I get paid for delivery. I get paid more if I say she fought." Lydia stepped forward, her voice shaking but fierce.